The Emergence of Second Language Learners' Intercultural Competence Through a COIL Exchange. Brian Wistner, Noriko Ishihara, and Akiko Murata. JALT PanSIG Conference 2021. Here is an overview of our presentation. First, we'll discuss the definition of COIL and identify some differences between study abroad programs and COIL exchanges. Next, we'll review some research that is related to study abroad and COIL. And finally, we'll examine a COIL project that was conducted between a Japanese university and an American university. Specifically, we'll focus on the development of the participants' intercultural competence. COIL stands for Collaborative Online International Learning. The overall purpose of COIL is to create an online framework to connect people throughout the world, enabling collaboration on projects, and the collaboration is generally technology-based collaboration. In education, a common scenario for a COIL exchange would be collaboration between students and teachers at different institutions in different countries. COIL is not a specific technology, but rather an approach to collaboration and education that potentially fosters cross-cultural awareness. You may be familiar with some similar terms. You may have heard globally networked learning, telecollaboration, or virtual exchange. Those are all similar to COIL. Next, let's look at the characteristics of study abroad and COIL. Generally speaking, study abroad, at least for university programs, usually have short-term or long-term options, and those could range anywhere from a few weeks to a few months or a semester or a year. Participants in study abroad encounter a new linguistic environment in addition to a new living environment, and they often go through an adjustment period where they'll experience phases of cultural adjustment, also sometimes referred to as culture shock. And generally speaking, the partner university will manage the overall experience and implementation of the curriculum. However, for a COIL exchange at the university level, it's usually embedded within a course. So professors must collaborate to create a COIL component in a course at both universities. And the goals and the learning outcomes must be decided before the course begins. The length of the COIL exchange is usually constrained to a portion of a course. So in a 15-week semester, generally speaking, the longest the COIL exchange would be 15 weeks, but more commonly it would be a shorter period, such as a few weeks embedded within a course. And the professors would then need to decide on which platform to use for the interaction, because the online learning platforms used at each university may be different. Next, we'll look at some research on study abroad and COIL exchanges. In study abroad, many studies focused on the effects of study abroad on second language development. You'll see this in studies of the linguistic environment and fluency, immersion, phonological memory and fluency, or changes in L2 developmental measures through study abroad, such as accuracy, complexity, and fluency. But some studies have examined aspects beyond these L2 developmental measures, such as pragmatic comprehension and learners' beliefs regarding autonomy and the role of teachers in the language learning process. However, for COIL, there is an emphasis on intercultural competence, which we'll look at next. A traditional approach to intercultural competence in language education often aims at the acquisition of knowledge about national cultures, especially those of the US and UK. However, intercultural competence can be reconceptualized more broadly to include reflexive and multifaceted awareness of taken-for-granted cultural assumptions. Intercultural communication can also be an opportunity for building embodied and emotive experience or awareness of cultural practices. Sorrells and Sekimoto also argue that in today's complex and interdependent global spaces, we need to develop interrelated consciousness to build social relations grounded in equity and social justice. Past research shows that despite some challenges, telecollaboration can provide learners with an authentic opportunity to interact with members of the target culture, thus contributing to a different type of subjective, experiential, and interactive learning that is unavailable in traditional materials or modes of instruction within the classroom. For example, According to one review of online intercultural exchanges and the development of intercultural communicative competence, telecollaboration can be effective in developing cultural learning, critical cultural awareness, and pragmatic competence as learners engage in the negotiation of meaning with real informants of the target culture. Lee and Song compared the development of intercultural competence of study abroad, telecollaborative, and traditional in-class students in Korea and the US. The study abroad learners had a direct, first-hand experience of the target culture through a variety of means. As a result, they developed specific and deeper levels of cognitive intercultural competence than those who learned via the telecollaboration approach. However, both telecollaboration and study abroad methods offered students opportunities to enhance their intercultural engagement through the development of friendships and self-disclosure, as well as opportunities to boost their confidence through repeated contact and the recognition of similarities. The authors concluded that telecollaboration can serve as an educational and cost-effective alternative to the study abroad method for developing effective and behavioral aspects of intercultural competence. Next, we'll describe the COIL exchange that we participated in the fall of 2020. On the Japanese university side, there were 12 sophomores from the Faculty of Letters. On the U.S. university side, there were 10 graduate students in an intercultural communication seminar. The students in the Japanese university were taking an English class, but that class dealt with content-based and art-based learning of English and social activism, while the graduate seminar in the United States focused on intercultural communication. The course goals for the English course at the Japanese university were to develop critical understanding of global issues, to learn English through art and COIL interactions, and to develop deeper intercultural understanding through direct intercultural interactions. On the U.S. side, the course goals were to develop intercultural competence to observe, analyze, self-reflect, and communicate with students in another culture. The COIL periods were 14 weeks for the English course in Japan and 8 weeks for the graduate seminar in the U.S. Initially, participants exchanged emails, they conducted video conferencing on Zoom, and made PowerPoint presentations and/or had class discussions, in addition to reflective statements, peer feedback, and instructor feedback. And for the data that we present today, all names are pseudonyms. Next, we'll look at an example of perceived language learning through the COIL exchange. Ken, who is a participant in the English class in Japan, expressed this in his final reflection. Before doing COIL presentation, I was not sure of my English skill, especially talking skill, but through talking with my US partner, I get confidence that I can talk with real English speaker. Then I get motivated from my experience, and now I plan going study abroad, instead of feeling sorrow about past one canceled by coronavirus. Looking back in the first time in this class, I thought this class is just a tough class. Actually, I think this class is not usual English class, but there are a lot of things that can improve my skills. Next, we will present some examples of student learning. First, some evidence of understanding of a global issue. As the telecollaboration coincided with COVID lockdowns and stay-home policies, issues of domestic violence or child abuse were often reported. Drawing on an art-based approach, a pop song advocating for child abuse prevention was used to introduce this topic and detailed a case in Pakistan, where women were often victims of acid attacks by their husbands. Women's resilience seeking financial independence through community collaboration was also discussed. Following this, the students were asked to research these themes independently and choose a relevant topic to discuss with their U.S. partners. While paying attention to the credibility of the information they found on the internet, students selected topics such as general tendencies or specific cases of domestic violence or child abuse in Japan, the US, India, Pakistan, and France, a comparison of violence used by men and women, intercultural differences with regard to child neglect, and similarities and differences between child abuse and discipline. Students prepared an individual Zoom interview of a U.S. partner and made an in-class presentation to report back their learning and reflection. One student, Mizuki, used this slide to report on the event named Domestic Violence Awareness Month, attended by her U.S. partner. Because the Japanese students were learning about social activism in the course, they appeared to have taken this as a real-world example of how university students can contribute to counter domestic violence. A limitation with regard to the interviews is that when U.S. students volunteered to share their personal experiences of child abuse, Japanese students failed to follow up, disappointing their U.S. partners. Japanese students may have felt that the topic was too private to explore, or they may have not been able to respond spontaneously or express empathy appropriately in the face of the shocking self-disclosure. Many of the Japanese students were overwhelmed by how socially aware and knowledgeable their U.S. partners were of the social issues they discussed on Zoom. One example of this was written by Nami in week 5. I conducted a Zoom interview with my partner. Because I didn't tell him the questions in advance, I thought it was hard for him to answer all questions on the spot. However, he answered all questions logically and gave me what I wanted to know. For example, when victims of domestic violence call police, they pretend to call delivery pizza, or many people in the U.S. turn a blind eye to domestic violence not to get in trouble. I can't describe everything in detail here, but I was really surprised and inspired by him. If I were in his position, I couldn't answer anything, even in Japanese. I learned from him that it's important to keep my eyes open for learning and have my opinions for various topics. At the end of the course, another student, Takuya, reflected on the overall COIL experience and stated, "One of the biggest cultural differences I felt was the difference in energy. When I interviewed my partner, Trump and Biden were very much in contention for the presidency. There has been a lot of activity against it in the U.S. My partner told me that although he did not participate in demonstrations, he did something similar. In Japan, there is no such thing, but the scale is much smaller. And more importantly, I don't think Japanese people have much interest in politics. If I don't do anything, I won't hurt myself, but I can't change anything. So I felt I needed to change my mind about that." Here we see a bit of stereotyping, but also we see how he feels ashamed of his own ignorance and indifference to politics, and he reconsiders his own attitude and belief that he won't be able to change social injustices. These quotes show the development of learners' reflexive awareness of their own cultural practices in light of their intercultural peers. In the interest of time, we are unable to show more data, but to sum up, the participants overwhelmingly welcomed this virtual exchange, taking this as an opportunity to interact authentically with real informants of the target culture. COIL was welcomed, perhaps all the more, for the canceled study abroad programs and financial constraints that preclude participation in study abroad. Our participants demonstrated enhanced motivation for language learning, confidence in their language skills, and self-regulated learning, as well as development of critical self-reflexivity. Limitations would include stereotypes that were readily drawn from the virtual interaction. In other words, students tended to jump to stereotypes to account for perceived cultural differences, which sometimes required the instructor's mediation. Students also experienced some cultural dissonances that occurred from unequal access to resources inherent in our instructional model, such as gaps in linguistic proficiency and the degree to which students were familiar with different technologies. For future instruction, enhanced pedagogies and teacher development appear to be necessary to promote effective telecollaboration. We also need further investigation of the impact of computer-mediated exchange on language and intercultural learning in wider contexts. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we look forward to talking with you at the conference.